Do you know that strange feeling when, in the middle of your everyday routine, you stumble upon a small, almost invisible clue, one that points straight to betrayal? I do now. And once you see it, the whole picture starts falling into place, piece by piece. You don't expect betrayal to come in through your credit card statements. I certainly didn't. But then again, I suppose I've always been the unromantic type. I'm a forensic accountant. When most people think of romance, they think of roses and poetry. I think of bank statements and cross-checked receipts. An open book, down to the dollar, and there's a certain satisfaction in that. For years, my girlfriend Laura was on board with this arrangement. She's the opposite of me, a marketing executive, always juggling clients, deadlines, and coffee dates with people whose names she forgets as soon as she meets them. We live together, but between my late nights combing through fraudulent accounts and her networking dinners, our paths barely crossed. So there I was on a regular Tuesday night, doing what I do best, reviewing statements. Most people would find this routine tedious, but I liked seeing everything in order. It's a little hobby of mine, and Laura's used to it. Or at least I thought she was. The joint credit card bill flashed on my screen. Routine stuff, groceries, gas, a few takeout charges. But then something caught my eye. La Belle Époque. An upscale restaurant downtown, one I knew of only by reputation. The kind of place that doesn't just set you back a few dollars, it practically charges you for breathing the air inside. I scrolled through my memory of recent conversations with Laura. Nothing about fancy dinners. In fact, she'd recently given me a lecture on cutting back on luxuries after her splurge on some business-class flights last quarter. I brushed it off. Maybe it was a client dinner. Her line of work is built on a foundation of pretentious dinners and overpriced cocktails. But a niggling thought held on, something about how specific this expense looked. I decided to let it go, until I saw the next one. And then another. Like puzzle pieces, each charge began forming a picture, each evening lining up neatly with times when Laura had been meeting old friends or attending after-hours work events. To say I was surprised would be putting it mildly. But I'm an accountant, not an actor. It's hard to pull emotions out of me unless there's a decent balance sheet to balance. So I decided to do what I do best. I went into forensic mode, pulling up not just the credit card bill but Laura's bank statement and calendar entries. Everything pointed to one clear, calculated outcome. Laura was cheating on me. The upscale dinners, the odd hotel charge, the social meetings that never quite added up, all leading to an elegant affair I wasn't invited to. Most people in my position might have panicked or confronted her right then and there. But again, I'm not most people. And if there's one thing I understand, it's the value of patience and precision. Laura might have forgotten about our little joint finances and the kind of detailed guy she was with, but I hadn't. No, I had something else in mind, something a bit more final. It was time for an accounting of a different sort. The next morning, I put on a smile, looked her in the eyes, and told her I had a surprise. How about a weekend getaway? I suggested. Just the two of us, out by the lake. A friend of mine has a private place and offered it to us. I thought we could use a little time together. Laura's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. A guilty conscience probably does that. She was thrilled, even looked a bit relieved. I told her we'd meet there separately, she could go straight from work, and I'd handle the logistics. The plan was already taking shape, as I noted every subtle expression on her face, every flicker of guilt she tried to mask. She thought she'd fooled me. Little did she know she was walking right into my hands. In morning, before heading out, I left a short, polite note on the counter with a gate code to the lake house. I knew full well she'd drive down there expecting a romantic escape, a clean slate where she could plaster on a facade of innocence. I even threw in a little handwritten, "Can't wait to see you tonight," just to keep the charade alive. I spent that afternoon dismantling our life with the same thoroughness I would any fraudulent account. I siphoned my share of the savings, moved it into a private account, canceled our credit cards, and left her name alone on the lease. Let her enjoy the luxury of paying rent solo. I didn't stop there. I trimmed our utility balance to the minimum too. If Laura was going to be spending her evenings with someone else, I figured she'd better get used to fending for herself financially. And now for the piece de resistance. In the afternoon, when she was supposed to leave, I returned home, took her home laptop, and logged into her social media accounts, both personal and professional, and scheduled a post, a photo of us from our last anniversary. The caption read, "Wishing you love, faithfulness, and a lifetime of happiness. Take care of each other." I set it to go live at 7:30 p.m., right when she'd be standing by the lake house gate wondering why I hadn't arrived. With everything in place, I gathered my own essentials, slipped out, and left our shared apartment as empty as a savings account after tax season. By the time Laura's evening began to unravel, I'd be miles away, sipping a nice whiskey and savoring every frustrated call she'd inevitably leave me. Just before walking out, I looked around at our empty apartment. Balance sheets clean, I muttered to myself, locking the door one last time. I didn't go to any lake. While Laura was en route to her little illusion of paradise, I settled myself comfortably in a quiet bar across town. My phone sat on the table, already buzzing with messages from her, each one demanding to know where I was and what exactly was going on with the gate code. I ignored them. For the first time in years, I felt like I was on vacation. The bartender glanced over at me, raising an eyebrow as I laughed at my screen. "Good news?" he asked. "Great news, actually. Just cleaning house." He nodded, giving me that blank, bartender's smile. I didn't elaborate. It was better this way, anonymous, quiet, and low-key, exactly how I preferred my revenge. I finally allowed myself to read Laura's messages, mostly for the comedy factor. Her tone shifted quickly from confusion to irritation, then to worry. The texts came in at a frantic pace. 6 p.m. "Hey, I can't get in. Are you nearby?" 6:30 p.m. "Ethan, are you close? The code isn't working." 7 p.m. "What's going on? Did you give me the wrong address?" The string of unanswered messages was beautiful in its simplicity, a symphony of her mounting frustration. Then, at 7:30 p.m. on the dot, my scheduled social media post went live. I imagined her scrolling through her feed. The post tagged her parents and a handful of her close friends, all people I knew she'd have to answer to, especially with the caption I'd chosen. Sure enough, my phone lit up with even more messages, each angrier than the last. The image of her pacing around in the dark by some random lake, frantically refreshing her feed, was so satisfying I almost felt guilty. Almost. 8 p.m. "You are seriously messed up, Ethan. People are calling me. My mother is calling me." She tried calling me too, and when I didn't pick up, she started leaving increasingly furious voice messages. The first one was indignant, and by the third, her voice had taken on a desperate edge. She must have realized, at some point, that she'd burned through all her resources. Our joint credit cards, her access to my car's GPS, the carefully curated online life she maintained for appearances, all of it was gone or ruined in a matter of hours. Somewhere between her 5th voicemail and her 10th text, she must have pieced together that this wasn't just a case of me being late. No, Laura, this was an audit. And she had failed. By now, I was on my second whiskey, enjoying the odd sense of calm that came with knowing I'd cut every last tie. I didn't need to keep tabs on her anymore. Whatever she did next was her problem, not mine. As the clock ticked past 9 p.m., I began scrolling through the reactions on our anniversary post. Friends had started chiming in with comments. Her mother, ever supportive, had written, "What a lovely message. So proud of you too." Her old college roommate, clearly trying to be subtle, commented, "Looking forward to catching up soon, Laura. Let me know when you're back from the getaway." It was delightful in a morbid sort of way. The irony was lost on none of them, except Laura's parents, who had always believed our relationship was destined for greatness. What would they say if they knew that their daughter had spent the better part of a year dining with someone who wasn't me, at restaurants she conveniently forgot to mention? Around 10 p.m., I finally decided to respond to one of her messages. I kept it short, simple. "Just try. The code should work fine." That really set her off. I could practically hear the steam coming out of her ears as I imagined her reading the message. She didn't wait long to call again, and this time, I decided to pick up. I let her fume, her words pouring out like a flood. Something about abandonment, betrayal, and how cruel I was for making her look like a fool. It was impressive how fast she'd managed to flip the script, turning herself into the victim in a matter of hours. Finally, I cut in. "Are you done?" I asked. "Because you sound awfully invested for someone who's been busy dining with old friends every week." Silence. Dead silence. It was as though someone had hit the mute button on her end. "Funny thing about those charges, Laura," I continued. "They show up every time you're at those little meetings. Every time I'm working late, you're somehow out dining at a restaurant you never mention. Got a little predictable, didn't it?" I can explain," she stammered, but there was no conviction behind her words. "Save it," I said, my voice finally losing its edge of calm. "You've been running your little scheme behind my back, and you thought I wouldn't notice? That's rich, coming from someone who's seen me comb through 1,000 fraudulent accounts. You were so sloppy I didn't even have to look twice." She didn't have an answer to that. I let her sit in the silence, her mind no doubt racing to come up with something, anything, to salvage what was left of her dignity. "Well," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "What happens now?" "Now," I said. "Now you go back to that apartment I've left you. The lease is in your name, utilities barely paid up. You might want to get cozy with that credit card debt too. Consider it a parting gift." She inhaled sharply, but she didn't respond. There was nothing left for her to say, and we both knew it. "And by the way," I added, unable to resist one last jab, "I'd recommend keeping off social media for a while. A lot of people seem to think we're on some romantic getaway. Wouldn't want them to know the truth, would we?" The call ended with a click, the final note of a symphony she'd orchestrated herself. I turned off my phone, pocketed it, and ordered a final drink. This last one wasn't for celebration, it was for clarity. A toast to clean slates, and to the realization that I didn't have to sift through life with someone who couldn't even balance a single account, let alone a relationship. Tomorrow, I'd start fresh, maybe somewhere new. But tonight, I was going to finish my drink and walk out of this bar a free man. I woke up the next morning feeling a strange, satisfying emptiness. It's the sort of feeling that only comes after you've spent the last shred of energy on something you know you'll never have to deal with again. I poured myself a coffee, and did what I do best, reviewed the numbers. Every loose end was tied. Laura wouldn't have access to my accounts, and she'd have to figure out how to make rent on her own. Her once stable life was now more of a financial sinkhole, and I knew that this time, no fancy client dinner or charming smile would pull her out. As I enjoyed the silence, a few messages pinged onto my phone. Laura had switched from anger to a barrage of pathetic apologies and thinly veiled threats, asking if we could talk about this like adults. One message caught my eye. "Please, Ethan. I can't lose everything over one mistake." One mistake? Interesting spin on a half-year affair, Laura. She tried calling again, leaving another desperate voicemail. I almost laughed listening to it. She'd somehow managed to switch from a heartfelt apology in the first sentence to implying it was my fault in the next, all in that maddeningly calm voice she used when she was selling someone a pitch. I could almost hear her marketing spin gears turning, working overtime to make herself the victim of this situation. For a moment, I considered deleting everything and letting her wallow, but where's the fun in that? I had one last card to play. By noon, I'd hatched an idea. I decided to make things a bit more public. Laura loved maintaining appearances. She prided herself on being the polished professional, the supportive girlfriend, the charming people person who could talk her way out of anything. I figured it was time for a final performance, one she couldn't rehearse her way through. I sat down and typed up an email. It was a piece of work, really. A polite, heartfelt message explaining that Laura and I were going our separate ways after a difficult but mature decision. I left out any explicit details but carefully alluded to her recent challenges with commitment. I made sure to BCC her closest friends, her boss, and, just for good measure, her parents. I hit send and leaned back, smiling at the thought of her desperately trying to patch things up with everyone on that list. A few hours later, my phone rang. Her number flashed on the screen, but I ignored it. A flurry of messages followed, some angry, some teary. She oscillated wildly between fury and remorse, as if trying to test which angle would get through to me. She'd clearly realized that her spotless reputation was officially on life support. Then, a final text popped up. "Please, Ethan. Don't ruin my life. We can fix this. I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Fix it? That would have been an option about 5 months ago, back when she was juggling client dinners and old friend meetups. Now, it was far too late for that. Still, part of me wanted to see what she'd do if she had one last chance to explain herself. Maybe she'd come up with a new excuse, something creative. So, against my better judgment, I decided to meet her. I told her to meet me at a cafe downtown. Neutral ground. I arrived a few minutes early and took a seat in the corner, watching her enter. She looked worse than I'd expected, her makeup hastily applied, her hair in disarray. For a second, I felt a flicker of sympathy, but it vanished as soon as she started talking. She sat down across from me, wringing her hands and glancing around as if anyone might recognize her. She looked at me with a strained, hopeful smile. "Ethan," she began, her voice low, "I know I hurt you. I know I made a mistake, but it doesn't have to end like this." I waited, saying nothing. Watching her struggle in that silence was all the satisfaction I needed. I was under a lot of pressure," she stammered. "Work has been insane, and I was just. It was a distraction, something stupid. It didn't mean anything. It was a horrible mistake, one I regret. But you're the one I want." That was the best she could come up with? That's the story she was going to stick to? I leaned forward, keeping my voice low and steady. "So you're telling me that for the past 6 months, those work dinners and old friends were just distractions? Something you didn't care about?" She nodded, almost eagerly. "Exactly. I was just caught up in the stress. It didn't mean anything. It's you, Ethan. It's always been you." I could almost admire the conviction in her lie, the way she delivered it as if it were a practiced line from a script. I nodded, pretending to consider her words. Then I opened my phone, scrolled to my gallery, and pulled up a photo. The work of a forensic accountant has its advantages. If you need some footage from surveillance cameras, even in such expensive restaurants, people are more willing to help you. One of the photos showed Laura in that very upscale restaurant, dressed to the nines, leaning across the table, holding the hand of a man. The intimacy was obvious, even in a still shot. I placed the phone on the table, screen up. "Would this be one of those distractions?" I asked, my tone almost conversational. Her face went pale. She tried to recover, reaching for the phone, but I pulled it back. "Don't bother," I said. "I have a few more, if you need them to jog your memory. You know, just to understand your pressures." Her gaze dropped, her confidence evaporating in an instant. "Ethan, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stood up, pocketing my phone. "You know what the worst part is, Laura? It's not that you cheated. It's that you thought I was stupid enough not to notice. You were never the smartest person in the room, but you played yourself like you were, didn't you?" She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on her lap. "Good luck, Laura," I said as I turned to leave. "I think you'll find that fixing this mistake is a lot harder than just talking your way out of it." As I walked out, I felt her eyes on me, felt the weight of her silence. It was done. The book was closed. There's something to be said about the peace that comes after you've cut all ties. It's like dropping a weight you didn't realize you've been carrying. As I left the cafe, I was already planning the next steps in my life, ones that didn't involve running into Laura's carefully manufactured drama. But as it turns out, sometimes closure doesn't come as neatly as we'd like. For a brief moment, I wondered if I'd been too harsh. But then my phone buzzed with a series of messages that reminded me just who I'd been dealing with. The first message was from Laura's best friend, Marissa, a real piece of work herself. The kind of friend who could have been a decent person if she weren't so adept at enabling Laura's worst impulses. The message was short, but it managed to hit every nerve I had left. "Ethan, I don't know what you're playing at, but this is cruel. Whatever issues you two had, airing them publicly was uncalled for. You need to take that post down now." I almost laughed. Laura had already set her PR team in motion, starting with her little circle of friends. I could imagine the story she'd spun to them, painting me as the cold, vengeful boyfriend who'd overreacted to a small mistake. They didn't know, of course, that this mistake involved a half-year affair disguised as business dinners. Nor did they know about the late nights, the lies, The credit card bills that didn't add up. I ignored Marissa's message, though I kept my phone handy out of pure curiosity. It didn't take long for the responses to trickle in. First a few more from mutual friends, some expressing shock, others defending her with the kind of loyalty only ignorance could justify. One message, however, caught my eye, from a number I didn't recognize. "Ethan, this is Paul. I think we should talk." Paul. I racked my brain, trying to place the name. And then it hit me. Paul was the man I'd seen in those photos with Laura, the one who'd been the most expensive distraction she'd ever had. Of all the people to reach out, her affair partner was the last one I expected. My first instinct was to ignore him. What could he possibly have to say that would make any difference? But curiosity got the better of me. I typed a curt reply. "Go ahead." The response came almost immediately. "I think we need to discuss what Laura's told you. There's more going on here than you realize." More going on, I thought. Was this guy seriously implying that he had some hidden insight into the mess Laura had created? I decided to humor him. "Meet me at Kessler Park." 10 minutes, I replied, naming a small, quiet park nearby where I could at least have a private conversation without anyone overhearing. Paul arrived right on time, looking exactly as I'd imagined him. Polished, dressed in a business suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and wearing an expression that managed to be both smug and nervous. It was clear he was someone used to getting his way, used to charming people into agreeing with him. "Ethan," he said, reaching out a hand. I ignored it, crossing my arms as I sized him up. "What is it you think I don't know?" I asked, not interested in small talk. He cleared his throat, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out from behind a bush. "Look, I know this is complicated," he began, already fumbling for the right words. "Laura and well, we've been involved, yes. But it's not what you think." I raised an eyebrow. "Not what I think. From where I'm standing, it looks pretty simple. She's been cheating, and you're the other guy. How much more complicated does it get?" He grimaced, shifting on his feet. "All right, yes. But Laura didn't tell me she was still seeing you. She told me you two were done months ago, that she was just waiting for the right time to officially move out. Is that so?" I asked, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "So she was just, what? Taking some time to collect her things over the course of 6 months." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I know how it sounds. But she was convincing. She said you were emotionally unavailable, that she'd tried everything, and you just wouldn't listen to her." I realize now that maybe I wasn't getting the whole picture. Ah yes, the classic emotionally unavailable card. Laura had thrown it my way a few times, though in her case, emotionally unavailable apparently meant not interested in funding endless client dinners and boutique hotel stays. "I'm not sure why you're telling me all this now," I said, cutting to the chase. "What do you want from me?" "Sympathy." He shook his head, his expression turning serious. "I wanted to warn you. Laura, she's going to spin this in a way that paints you as the villain. She's already reaching out to people, saying you blindsided her, that this was some cruel setup. She even hinted that you've been abusive, controlling. She's good at this, Ethan. She's going to make you the bad guy." I felt a slow, burning anger begin to build. It wasn't enough for her to betray me. She had to rewrite the narrative to suit her, to make sure she came out of this smelling like roses. This wasn't just a matter of cheating, it was a full-blown PR campaign. And I knew Laura well enough to know she was more than capable of pulling it off. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "So what are you saying? You're suddenly on my side." He sighed. "Look, I don't want to see anyone get hurt. I think we both know Laura's manipulative, but she's good at it. I just thought you deserved a heads up." I nodded slowly, absorbing his words. He was right about one thing. Laura had a knack for twisting the truth. And if she was already painting me as some sort of controlling villain, I had a feeling things were about to get worse. "Well," I said, finally breaking the silence, "thanks for the warning. But I think it's time Laura faced some consequences she can't charm her way out of." Paul gave a slight nod, seeming to accept that he was no longer a part of this equation. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I watched him leave, the wheels in my mind turning as I considered my next move. Laura thought she could get away with rewriting our story, painting herself as the poor, victimized girlfriend caught in a toxic relationship. But I had something she didn't: a clear, meticulous paper trail and a sharp memory for every one of her indiscretions. This was no longer just about revenge. This was about setting the record straight, ensuring that everyone who mattered knew the real story. Her PR campaign be damned. I took one last look at the quiet park, a plan forming in my mind. Laura wanted to make this public? Fine. But I had a feeling she wasn't going to enjoy the attention she was about to receive. After meeting Paul, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. If Laura wanted to play dirty and paint herself as the victim, then she'd have to do it with full transparency, my transparency to be precise. So I went back to my apartment, powered up my laptop, and got to work. I started by pulling together every digital shred I'd collected over the last few weeks. Credit card statements, dinner receipts, calendar screenshots, and photos. I had everything laid out in chronological order, each piece painting a vivid picture of Laura's distractions. It was neat, indisputable, and so precisely organized that I could practically feel my accountant's heart swelling with pride. But then I stopped. Part of me realized that taking the nuclear route wouldn't just expose Laura, it'd also make me look like the bitter ex who couldn't take a breakup gracefully. It wasn't enough to simply prove she'd been unfaithful. No, if I wanted this to work, I'd need to make sure everyone could see through her carefully constructed mask without any need for me to look petty. I made a few calls. First, to a lawyer friend who specialized in defamation and slander. Then to a mutual friend, Lisa, who had always been skeptical of Laura but tolerated her for my sake. She had a large social circle and was notorious for spreading gossip, and she just so happened to work with Laura's company. If anyone could introduce a few truths into Laura's social network without making it look like a direct attack from me, it was her. By the time evening rolled around, Lisa had agreed to meet me at her favorite coffee shop. I filled her in on the details, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. She listened, leaning in as I described Laura's PR maneuver to paint me as the villain. Lisa wasn't one to take sides quickly, but I could see the wheels turning as I laid out the evidence. "So," Lisa said, stirring her coffee with a bemused expression, "you're telling me Laura's been cheating for months, and now she's spinning it like you're some kind of jealous stalker?" "That's about the gist of it," I replied, sliding a few of the receipts and calendar screenshots her way. "I'd show you more, but you get the idea. I thought maybe you could, set the record straight." She studied the receipts, then looked up, her eyes flashing with a mix of intrigue and anger. "I can't stand people who play the victim," she muttered. "Don't worry, Ethan. I've got this." With that, I handed her a neatly organized folder of evidence. Nothing too inflammatory, just enough to make it clear that Laura wasn't exactly the innocent party she wanted people to think she was. Lisa's expression told me she knew exactly what to do with it. "Consider it done," she said, patting my shoulder. "Laura's reputation has been on thin ice with some people for a while now. This should be all it takes to tip her over." The next day, my plan began to unfold, one whisper at a time. By noon, my phone was buzzing again, but this time, the messages were from people who'd clearly heard the other side of Laura's story. They wanted to know if it was true that she'd been seeing someone else while using me as her financial crutch. Friends started texting to ask how I was holding up, expressing their shock at how low she'd stooped. Even better, someone from her office, likely Lisa's doing, let it slip that Laura had been using business dinners to disguise her nights out with Paul. By the time her workday ended, I imagined she must have walked out of that office with everyone's judgmental eyes burning into her back. But the best part was yet to come. That evening, while Laura was still processing the quiet erosion of her reputation, I posted a new update on social media. Nothing over the top, just a simple status update with a link to an article about the importance of transparency in relationships. I'd selected the perfect quote from the article as a caption. "True commitment means being able to look at yourself in the mirror and know you've been honest with the people who trusted you most." It was indirect enough to avoid looking like an attack, but pointed enough that everyone who mattered understood. I received a flurry of supportive comments and private messages, many of them subtle digs at Laura, whose silence on social media was beginning to feel deafening. Meanwhile, I kept a close eye on Laura's online presence. She'd gone silent, probably scrambling to figure out what to do next. I could almost feel her panicking through the screen as she tried to salvage her crumbling reputation. She might have even suspected I was behind it, but there was no proof, just like there'd been no proof in her own web of lies. Then, late that night, she finally broke her silence. She posted a cryptic message, the kind designed to look deep and introspective, but that really just masked her desperation. People often judge what they don't understand. Those who truly know me will know my heart. I couldn't have asked for a better response. Her post only made her look guiltier, as though she was trying to defend something no one had directly accused her of. It was exactly what I'd wanted, to make her feel just vulnerable enough to reveal herself without me ever having to lift a finger. I was still savoring the effect of her post when I received a message from Lisa. Mission accomplished. You should have seen the look on her face today. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I responded with a simple, thank you, and poured myself a drink. This was the culmination of my work, the final tally of a relationship that had been a bad investment from the start. But just as I was about to turn off my phone for the night, it buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen, and there, in the dim light, was Laura's name. Against my better judgment, I opened the message. Ethan, I know this was you. I can't believe you'd be so cruel. After everything we had, you really think I deserve this? I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed a quick response. Deserve? No, Laura, this isn't about what you deserve. It's about what you earned. There was no reply. And I didn't expect one. She knew as well as I did that this was no longer about love, forgiveness, or even closure. It was about balancing the scales. As I turned off my phone, I felt an odd sense of peace. Laura could try whatever she wanted, spin whatever story she thought might help. But in the end, she'd made her own bed. And now, finally, she'd have to lie in it, without me to cushion the fall. The following morning, I woke up to radio silence. After Laura's final message and my response, it seemed she'd either resigned herself to her new reality or was simply strategizing her next move. Either way, I enjoyed the quiet. But predictably, Laura couldn't stay out of my life for long. Around noon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I picked up, I was met with a curt, familiar voice. Ethan, it's Marissa. Ah, the best friend. I figured she'd show up eventually. Is there something you need, Marissa? I asked, not in the mood for her usual theatrics. Actually, yes, she replied, her tone sharp. We need to talk about Laura. She's been a complete mess ever since you did. Whatever it is you did to her. She won't say much, but it's obvious you're the reason she's suddenly a social pariah. I stifled a laugh. A social pariah? Clearly, the truth had spread faster than even I'd planned. I could almost see Laura frantically backpedaling, scrambling to control the damage while Marissa and her friend stood on the sidelines, watching it all go up in flames. Marissa, I don't see how this involves you, I said, keeping my tone light. Well, it involves me because Laura's my friend. And whatever happened between you two, it's made her miserable. I know she made a mistake, but did you really have to turn her life into a public spectacle? Her indignation was almost entertaining. Here she was, coming to Laura's defense, completely oblivious to the months of deception, the lies, and the financial drain. To Marissa, this was a simple matter of a mistake that could be waved away with the right apology. I sighed. Marissa, I'm not interested in playing the villain here. Laura's actions are her own, and I've done what I needed to protect myself from them. Maybe you should ask her about those mistakes she made before you come here waving her flag. There was a long pause on the other end. I could tell she was holding back, either unsure of how to respond or unwilling to accept the truth of the situation. Then, in a huff, she said, Fine. But you know, karma has a way of catching up with people, Ethan. One day, you're going to regret treating her like this. With that, she hung up, leaving me alone with my coffee and a sense of smug satisfaction. Later that week, I returned to my usual routine. Without Laura's demands, I found my life remarkably simpler. I could go out when I wanted, work late if needed, and I didn't have to check our finances daily like I was handling an account in need of constant reconciliation. My life had regained a certain rhythm, one that Laura's antics had disrupted for far too long. But, as I soon found out, Laura wasn't quite ready to let go. It was Friday evening, and I just sat down to unwind when a knock sounded at my door. When I opened it, there she was, Laura, looking far from the composed professional I was used to. She was disheveled, her eyes puffy, her expression both apologetic and desperate. "Ethan," she began, barely meeting my gaze. "Can I come in?" I considered it for a moment. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her in. She stood in the living room, glancing around Then, she took a shaky breath. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, and myself. But I need you to understand, Ethan, I never meant for any of this to happen." I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter as I studied her. Never meant for what to happen, exactly? The affair? The lies? Or this little campaign to paint me as the bad guy? She flinched, clearly caught off guard by my bluntness. I was lost, all right? Things between us had changed. You were always working, always focused on numbers and spreadsheets, and I needed something else. I didn't think it would go this far. The audacity of her response was almost impressive. She had somehow managed to turn her own infidelity into a story about my supposed emotional negligence, the implication being that I had somehow driven her to cheat. "So let me get this straight," I said, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "You cheat on me for 6 months, but somehow it's my fault for not being emotionally available? That's rich, even for you, Laura." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You're not exactly perfect, Ethan. You're so clinical. You treat everything like it's a transaction. Is it really that surprising that I wanted something more?" A twisted part of me almost admired her nerve. Here she was, standing, and accusing me of failing to meet her emotional needs as if that were some sort of justification for betrayal. I shook my head, barely able to hold back a bitter laugh. "Laura, I hope you find whatever something more you're looking for," I said, gesturing toward the door. "Because whatever it is, you won't find it here." She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "This conversation is over. You made your choices, and I made mine. Now it's time you live with the consequences." She glared at me, her expression hardening. For a moment, I thought she might lash out, scream, or do something dramatic. But instead she simply nodded, her face going pale as she realized that the last thread of sympathy I might have had for her was gone. Without another word, she turned and walked out, the sound of the door clicking shut behind her echoing through the room. When she left, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was it, the final chapter closed. I'd given her a chance to explain herself, and all she'd done was deflect and rationalize, just as I'd expected. She was never going to take responsibility for her actions, never going to see herself as anything other than a victim of circumstances she'd created. I poured myself a drink, raising it in a mock toast to the empty apartment. "To clean slates and empty balance sheets," I muttered. I'd learned something from all this, something that went beyond Laura's betrayal or the months of deception. I'd learned that sometimes people will never see the damage they cause, even when it's right in front of them. They'll always find a way to justify it, to turn themselves into the hero or the victim, depending on what suits them best. As for me, I'd survived the audit of my relationship and come out with a clear perspective. I had no plans to dive back into dating anytime soon, and I knew my life was better off without someone who saw relationships as financial safety nets rather than genuine partnerships. With a final sip of whiskey, I settled back, feeling something close to contentment. Laura could have her excuses, her stories, and her attempts at redemption. But from now on, my life would be on my terms, with every account in perfect balance.